The small fishing village of Coldwater, nestled on the inhospitable coast of Alaska, had always carried a mantle of mystery and isolation. Its inhabitants, mostly descendants of the first settlers who sought refuge from civilization, lived in an almost deafening silence, broken only by the distant cry of gulls and the constant roar of the Bering Sea. The houses, built of sturdy wood and painted in shades faded by time and sea spray, seemed to cling precariously to the rocks, silent, witnesses to countless storms and secrets whispered on the wind. Life there followed a slow, unchanging rhythm, marked by the tides, the fishing seasons, and the dark stories passed down from generation to generation, told around crackling bonfires on long winter nights. One such story, the most feared and rarely mentioned, was that of the Tide Shadow, a spectral entity said to inhabit the frigid, treacherous waters around the village, dragging those who dared to defy its fury or cross its path in moments of darkness to the depths. On a particularly biting November night, when snow fell in thick flakes and the wind howled like a hungry wolf, a young man named Elias, just 17, disappeared without a trace. Elias was known for his impulsive nature and his fascination with the sea, even when conditions were unfavorable. That afternoon, against the warnings of his grandmother, a 73-year-old woman whose eyes seemed to carry the weight of many lives and countless harsh winters, he had taken his small motorboat to check the fishing traps he had set hours earlier, near the isolated bay known as Lost Souls Cemetery, due to the numerous shipwrecks that had occurred there over the years. Hours dragged slowly, painting the sky in increasingly darker shades, and Elias did not return. Concern soon turned to panic as the storm intensified, making any sea search virtually impossible. The following morning, when the storm's fury finally gave way to a tense calm, a group of experienced fishermen, led by old Jacob, a 68-year-old man whose hands were calloused by ropes and whose face was a map of countless maritime journeys, set out in search of Elias. They navigated cautiously through the agitated waters, their hearts heavy with a dark premonition. They found Elias's small boat adrift near the rugged cliffs of the bay, rocking like a forgotten toy. There was no sign of the young man. The fishing traps were empty, and the boat's engine was inexplicably off. A thick fog hung over the water, giving the landscape a ghostly and oppressive air. Jacob, his voice hoarse and heavy with experience, murmured ancient words, invoking the protection of the sea spirits, but even he felt a shiver run down his spine. Something there did not seem to be the work of a simple accident. There was a heavy, almost spectral silence that hung over the bay, as if nature itself was in mourning. The search stretched on for days, involving the entire Coldwater community. Coastal sweeps were conducted, and experienced divers ventured into the icy, murky waters, but no trace of Elias was found. The only thing that returned from the depths, brought by a treacherous current, was one of his boots, waterlogged and covered in algae, with a deep tear on the side that seemed to have been caused by something sharp. Elias's grandmother, Martha, a woman with a stern demeanor but a heart full of love for her grandson, began to waste away, consumed by grief and anguish. She spent hours gazing at the rough sea, her lips moving in silent prayers, begging for her beloved grandson's return or for some sign that would bring her peace. The other villagers tried to comfort her, but they knew, deep in their hearts, that Elias had been taken by the Tide Shadow, becoming another lost soul in the ocean's relentless depths. Terror settled over Coldwater, a silent and constant fear that hung over every conversation, every glance cast at the sea, reminding them of the fragility of life in the face of the mysterious and relentless forces that lurked in the shadows of the deep. 2 years had passed since Elias's disappearance, and sadness still hung like a dense fog over Coldwater. Martha, Elias's grandmother, had not recovered. Her hair, once gray, was now an almost translucent white, and her eyes, once filled with austere vivacity, had become distant and empty, fixed on an invisible point on the horizon. The village, which once resonated with children's laughter and fishermen's chatter, now seemed to have been gagged by grief and fear. No one ventured alone into the deep waters anymore, especially after dusk. The stories of the Tide Shadow ceased to be mere legends and became a grim warning, a constant reminder of the fragility of human life in the face of the unknown lurking beneath the waves. The fishermen, who were the heart and soul of Coldwater, began to fish only in shallow waters, and during the day, their restless eyes constantly sweeping the horizon, looking for any sign of anomaly, any strange movement that might indicate the presence of that dark entity. It was then that the incidents began to intensify in more disturbing and inexplicable ways. First, there were reports of whispers coming from the sea on new moon nights, indistinct voices and laments that seemed to call out specific names. Then came the macabre discoveries. On a gray morning, the body of a 25-year-old whaler, Samuel, was found on the beach, washed ashore by the tide. His face was contorted in a mask of pure terror, and on his arms, deep, shapeless marks, as if huge claws had dragged him from the boat. The residents of Coldwater gathered on the beach, their faces pale and their hearts pounding. Local authorities, a small detachment of Coast Guard agents who rarely dealt with anything more serious than minor fishing infractions, attributed the death to a marine animal attack. But the community knew the truth. No known creature in Alaska would leave marks of that kind, and the terror in Samuel's eyes was something that death by drowning or animal attack would not explain. Panic spread like an uncontrollable wildfire. House windows were barricaded, doors reinforced, and no one dared to go out alone after dark anymore. Children were forbidden to play near the water, and women clung to their rosaries, reciting quiet prayers, begging for divine protection. The fear of the tide shadow became a palpable reality, a terror that suffocated life in the village. Amidst this chaos and despair, an ancient book of local legends, dusty and almost forgotten in the village's small library, began to be consulted by some of the elders, among them Reverend Thomas, a 49-year-old man with a thick beard and a penetrating gaze who had arrived in Coldwater only 5 years prior, but who possessed a deep knowledge of local traditions and superstitions. The book spoke of an ancient pact made between the first inhabitants of the region and an aquatic entity, a primordial being that demanded sacrifices in exchange for protection against the most violent storms and the most devastating tides. With each new disappearance, each new body found, the legend became more real and more terrifying. A young 31-year-old nurse, Clara, who had come from Anchorage to help in the small local infirmary, was the next victim. She was last seen on the dock watching the sunset, a pastime she had adopted since moving to Coldwater. The next morning, only her glasses and a blue scarf were found floating near the pier, and the community knew she had been dragged into the depths, just like Elias and Samuel. Reverend Thomas, his voice choked with fear, began to preach about the need to find a way to appease the entity or to fight it. He spoke of ancient rituals and offerings, but the truth was that no one knew for sure what to do. The terror was absolute, and Coldwater was on the brink of an abyss, watching its youngest and most vibrant souls reaped by the relentless tide shadow. If you're feeling a chill down your spine and this story has gripped you, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next accounts that will keep you up at night. And now, tell me, if you had to face the tide shadow, what would you do to try to survive? Use your creativity and your survival instinct in the comments. Despair was taking root in Coldwater, almost as deep as the waters surrounding the village. Martha, Elias's grandmother, no longer left her house. Her days were spent in front of the window, her gaze fixed on the sea, murmuring softly about the need to appease the hunger. The villagers, in turn, were divided between paralyzing fear and a growing fury. Some wanted to flee, to abandon Coldwater and its horrors, but most of them knew no other life, had nowhere to go. Others, more audacious, clamored for retaliation, for a way to fight against what was claiming them one by one, even if they didn't know how to face such an ancient and powerful entity. Reverend Thomas, who had become the community's main support point in times of crisis, delved even deeper into the ancient texts, seeking an answer, a loophole in the legend of the tide shadow that could offer a glimpse of hope. With each passing day, Reverend Thomas grew more somber, his once calm and serene countenance now marked by insomnia and tension. He read and reread passages in archaic Latin and forgotten dialects, his fingers tracing the yellowed pages of books that seemed to have seen ages. One rainy afternoon, While flipping through a leather-bound tome he had found hidden in the church basement, a specific passage caught his attention. It spoke of a purification of the waters ritual, which involved a sacrifice, but not a sacrifice, of life, rather something equally valuable, the memory of deep pain and attachment to the past. The legend said that the tide shadow fed on the anguish and grief of souls lost at sea, and that only the forgetting of those painful memories could appease it. The Reverend called a meeting in the church, which had once been a place of celebration, and now had become a sanctuary of fear. His voice choked with emotion, he explained the discovery. The idea was radical and terrifying. They needed to release the past, let go of the pain of those taken by the sea. This meant no longer mourning Elias, Samuel, Clara, and the others, no longer reliving the pain of loss. It was a proposal that demanded superhuman strength, a denial of a fundamental human instinct. At first there was uproar. How could they simply forget their loved ones? How could they erase from memory the image of their faces, the sound of their voices? But terror was a cruel master, and the desire to survive outweighed everything. Each night another boat disappeared, another person vanished without a trace, and desperation became an incentive to try the unthinkable. Old Martha was the first to vehemently object. The idea of forgetting Elias was, to her, a betrayal, a denial of her grandson's existence. She refused to participate in any ritual that would erase his memory. Her pain was her last link to him, and she clung to it with fierce obstinacy. However, the community of Coldwater, realizing that the situation was becoming unsustainable and that the village was slowly dying, began to pressure her. Reverend Thomas reasoned with her for hours, explaining that it was not about forgetting love, but the pain of attachment to loss. That the memory of love would remain, but the anguish that fed the entity, that indeed should be dissipated. It was an agonizing decision, but Coldwater's survival depended on it. Martha's anguish was as palpable as the fog that embraced the village, but deep in her heart, she knew that if they didn't do something, there would be no one left to remember. Elias. Reverend Thomas, with the help of Jacob and some of the older fishermen, began to prepare the ritual. There were no candles, no incense, no religious chants, just a bonfire in the center of the beach, fed with pieces of wood brought from shipwrecks and personal belongings of those who had been taken, a symbolic act of detachment. The community gathered around the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames and their eyes silently tearful. The night was cold and the moon, almost full, cast a pale glow over the water. Reverend Thomas, standing, his hands raised in a solemn gesture, began to recite ancient words. A prayer not to God, but to the depths, a plea for peace and liberation. As he spoke, personal objects were thrown into the fire, one by one, each representing a painful memory being released, a burden being surrendered to the purifying flames. Dark spirals of smoke rose, mingling with the mist that crept from the sea, and a heavy silence hung over the beach, broken only by the crackle of wood and the muffled sobs of a few. As more objects were consumed by the flames, and Reverend Thomas's words echoed in the darkness, a subtle change began to be perceived in Coldwater's atmosphere. The fog, once oppressive and dense, seemed to thin, revealing the silhouette of distant mountains and the faint sparkle of stars. The temperature, though still low, became less biting, and the wind, which had previously howled with fury, now blew in a melancholic whisper, almost a distant lament. Martha, Elias's grandmother, observed the ritual with a mixture of pain and almost morbid curiosity. Her hands, previously tightly clasped in her lap, began to tremble, and her eyes, which had expressed an almost absolute emptiness, now showed a flicker of uncertainty, as if she were at a crossroads between memory and survival. At the climax of the ritual, as the last offerings were cast into the fire and Reverend Thomas uttered the final words with the full force of his voice, a strange and terrifying phenomenon occurred. From the depths of the sea, a sound emerged, a long, drawn-out moan that seemed to carry the pain of 1,000 lost souls. The water, previously calm under the moonlight, began to bubble violently, and a dark, formless shape rose from the surface. It was not a monster of scales and teeth, but something more terrifying, a pulsating mass of shadows and water, with contours that seemed to writhe and dissolve, and in its center, two luminous icy points, like eyes that watched with an insatiable hunger. The tide shadow had manifested, not as a distant legend, but as a living, hideous entity, revealing the true face of the terror that had plagued Coldwater. Panic erupted on the beach. Screams echoed in the night, and people began to run, stumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to get away from the creature. Reverend Thomas, however, stood firm, his hands still raised, his lips reciting the final words of the ritual with unshakable determination. He knew this was the crucial moment, the final test of their faith and the community's courage. The tide shadow approached the shore, crawling onto the sand like a black tide, its shapeless forms extending towards the terrified villagers. A putrid scent of salt and decay hung in the air, suffocating everyone. The creature seemed to suck the ambient light, making the night even darker, and the bonfire, which had previously burned intensely, seemed to diminish, as if the heat itself was being absorbed by the entity. In that moment of absolute terror, old Martha, propelled by a force she herself didn't understand, stepped forward, her voice weak but laden with a pain that resonated in the cold air. She raised her hands towards the creature, not in defiance, but in a gesture of surrender and liberation. "I give you my pain, Shadow," she whispered, her tears mingling with the night's dew. "Elias's pain. I release it. Go in peace." Her words, spoken with breathtaking sincerity, seemed to hit the creature like a shock. The shadowy mass trembled, and the luminous eyes flickered, as if the entity was confused, disoriented by something it hadn't expected. It was not despair and lament that strengthened it, but the voluntary surrender of the pain that fed it. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the tide shadow began to recede. The shapeless form contracted, and the glow in its eyes diminished. The moan that had emerged from the sea transformed into a softer lament, almost a sigh of relief, and the creature began to sink back into the depths, dissolving into the dark water from which it had come. The fog, which had retreated, now completely dissipated, revealing a clear, starry sky, and a silence, not of fear, but of a newfound peace, hung over Coldwater. The ritual had worked. The tide shadow had been appeased, not by violence, but by the surrender of the pain that fed it. The residents of Coldwater watched the scene with a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and a deep reverence for what they had witnessed. The village had been saved, but at a cost that would mark their souls forever. The morning after the ritual brought an unusual stillness to Coldwater. Not the oppressive silence of fear, but a profound peace and an almost palpable relief. The sky was a clear blue, the sun shone on the calm waters of the sea, and the gulls cried out again in the air, their call seeming to carry a melody of renewal. The villagers, exhausted but with a glint of hope in their eyes, began to clean the beach, gathering the remnants of the bonfire and the last memories of the night of terror. The heavy air of anguish that had suffocated the village for so long was no longer present. A lightness, a feeling that an immense burden had been lifted from their shoulders, hung in the air. The tide shadow had disappeared, and with it, the cycle of deaths and disappearances that had haunted Coldwater seemed to have come to an end. Martha, despite her exhaustion, seemed to have regained some of her vitality. Her gaze, once lost, now held a serenity that had been absent before. She had not forgotten Elias. The love for her grandson remained intact in her heart, but the searing pain of loss and the anguish that consumed her had been released. She walked to the water's edge, the gentle wind rustling her white hair, and watched the sea with a different gaze, no longer one of fear, but of respect. The tide shadow was no longer a terrifying entity in her mind, but a force of nature, a presence that demanded understanding and not just dread. The village had learned a brutal but valuable lesson. Pain, when not processed and released, can become nourishment for shadows, attracting and strengthening the darkest aspects of the world. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Coldwater began to flourish again. Fishermen once more cast their nets into deeper waters, Now, with a new respect for the sea and a deeper understanding of its forces, children returned to playing on the beaches, their laughter echoing through the houses, bringing back the life and joy that had been stifled by fear. Reverend Thomas remained in the village, no longer merely a pastor focused solely on dogma, but as a guardian of local traditions and history, a link between the visible and invisible worlds. He dedicated his time to recording the events of that night, not to keep fear alive, but to preserve the memory of the lesson learned and the community's strength in the face of indescribable horror. The story of the tide shadow continued to be told in Coldwater, but in a different way. It was no longer a terrifying legend whispered in the dark to scare children, but a narrative of overcoming, of human resilience, and of the complex relationship between humans and nature. They spoke of how fear and pain could manifest in unimaginable ways, but also of the capacity for liberation and finding peace, even after the most terrible events. The village became a living testament that, even in the depths of terror, hope and redemption can be found, provided one is willing to face their own shadows and release what no longer serves them. Coldwater, once synonymous with isolation and despair, had transformed into a beacon of resilience, a community that had survived its own darkness and emerged stronger, more united, and with ancient wisdom etched into its souls. The memory of those who were lost, like Elias, Samuel, and Clara, was not erased. Their names were whispered with fondness, not with pain, and their stories became part of the fabric of Coldwater, reminding everyone of the importance of caring for each other and honoring the bonds that united them. The sea, which was once a source of fear, was now viewed with renewed respect, its depths holding secrets and wisdom that humanity still needed to uncover. Coldwater, the small village at the edge of the world, had found its redemption in the icy waters of Alaska, proving that even the most terrible shadows can be dispelled when the light of understanding and liberation shines brightest. If this journey into the depths of terror and hope has captivated you, subscribe to the channel right now. Join our community of suspense lovers and unravel with us the mysteries that the darkness holds. We'd love to know, what did you think of this story from Coldwater? Did it make you think differently about fear or loss? Share your own stories, your impressions, or even what you learned from this journey in the comments below. Your voice is very important to us. Let's build a space together where terror is intriguing and interaction is engaging.